if we can start by introducing our panel, starting with Rosalind, please.
Hello everybody, my name is Rosalind Palmer and I am a registrar at Norfolk Museum Service. I've worked in collections management roles, whether that's registrar or documentation, for almost 15 years now. Worked at Norfolk Museum Service, this is my second stint here, but I've also worked at the National Maritime Museum and the Wellcome Collection before that.
Great, thanks Rosalind. And next up is Tanya.
Hello everyone, my name's Tanya Simpson and I'm the Collection Services Manager at National Museums Liverpool. So my role there is leading the Collection Services team. So I'm responsible for the technical team, the registrars, our Mimsy technical specialist, storage team and the photography section. And I've also worked in collections management now for probably about 12 years. So before Liverpool, I worked at Birmingham Museums, British Museum, but I've also worked at smaller local authority museums as well.
Great, thanks Tanya. And Philip?
Morning everybody. So yes, I'm Philip Claris. I work for South East Museums Development, so in sector support. My role is accreditation advisor, so I sort of support museums across the Southeast in their accreditation journey, which includes quite a lot of collections management, of course. I've also done some work in this field in terms of consultancy, and prior to that, for a long time, working for the National Trust. I won't go throughout the entire history, but dealing with a lot of collection information and documentation work and projects dispersed really across the whole of sort of National Trust properties, so quite a range of different situations.
Great, thanks Philip. And Shona?
Hi there, my name is Shona Elliott. I work for Aberdeen Archives, Gallery and Museums. I am the lead curator for Collections Access. So in my team we have, it's collections management, so a loans officer, documentation officer, stores officer, photographer, and so on. I have over 15 years experience in the collections management field as well. I've also done some art curation.
Great, thanks everyone. So a wealth of experience from our panel. We do have a mixture of people who are currently working in museums doing this sort of work, and also sector support organisations represented by Philip and myself to an extent as the chair of the discussion. So lots I think that we can talk about. For those of you who were expecting Lindsay Jones to be on our panel from Northwest Museum Development, unfortunately Lindsay did have to pull out of the session. So if those of you who've seen our panelist list and wondering where she is, unfortunately she couldn't make it, but there's still plenty of us on the panel, and as I say, your contributions in the chat and in the Q&A are very welcome as well. And I can see a lot of weather chat in the chat already, so a real mix of weather in the room. But do respond to anything that we say, kind of pop things in the chat, and if you've got specific questions, pop them in the Q&A. So I thought it might be helpful to give a bit of context as to why we've decided to do this discussion. And I think it was worthwhile doing, considering I think we had about 40 people sign up to join this conversation. So there's clearly a bit of an appetite to hear some thoughts related to that. It's something that comes up a lot in our workshops and our training, this sort of, how do I persuade this person that this is important, or that actually we need to prioritise this work over this work, or whatever the question might be. So advocacy and making the case for documentation does come up a lot in our sessions. And we don't always have the time within a training session to dedicate a proper in-depth conversation to that. So we thought it might be useful to have this panel discussion just to give you a few thoughts, a few sort of nuggets, things to think about in your own organisations. Sometimes the issues that come up with advocacy are very day-to-day practical issues, maybe around things like locations or signing of paperwork, whatever it might be. Some of the issues that come up might be more broader sector issues. So how do I persuade my organisation that we need to review our use of terminology or be more inclusive with our cataloguing practice, whatever it might be. So I think today's discussion might reflect that as well, the difference between sort of practical stuff and the broader sector issues. And when we think about making the case for documentation, I think it's worth just considering whether what you need to do is inform. So are we trying to raise awareness of something within the organisation, or are we trying to persuade or convince someone, which is more the advocacy side of things? And they do often obviously go hand in hand. They're very much connected. So for example, you might need data and information from an audit to inform someone that there are a certain percentage of missing locations or whatever the issue might be. But then you might also have to persuade them why that's an issue and why it's a priority for action. So they do usually go hand in hand, but I think that's worth bearing in mind in the context of what we're talking about and any issues that you might be working through as well. So in terms of the format, as I say, we've got the chat, we've got the Q&A. Some of you submitted some issues to discuss in advance as well. So I think we're going to start with those and we're just going to see where the conversation takes us. So we'll be responding to things that you have submitted and also responding to each other within the conversation as well. So it's not a straight Q&A, it really is a discussion amongst our panelists. So to kick things off, we are going to start with one of the questions or issues that was submitted, which was how we can support colleagues to see the value of good documentation, which is quite a big question. And I think Shona has volunteered to sort of kick off the discussion with that point. So I'll hand over to Shona at this point.
Thanks, Sarah. So one thing I would say is become more visible. I think it's really easy to assume that your colleagues know exactly what you're doing, but often it's really not the case. I think now we've got so used to having online team meetings, I think embrace that, use that opportunity for actually showing what you do. We had a few months ago, we shared eMuseum, which is our online catalogue. We've been making recent changes to it. My colleague, a documentation officer, showed the screen during an online meeting, going all the fantastic changes that we've made, how the searching had improved, how there were new displays for people to see online, all these changes, and it was a fantastic session because our colleagues were going, oh wow, this is, there's all this context and they may have not realized before. So I think it's a really powerful tool, just actually communicate and say what you're doing. The other thing is make it clear what's in it for them. So for instance, good documentation obviously helps out curators and exhibition officers. If you've not got it recorded, if a painting is glazed or not, it really is actually quite time consuming to go and hunt for to find the picture, find out whether it's glazed, just to see if you can even incorporate it into an exhibition, or if you need to fork out money for glazing and so on. Having keywords is obviously fantastic for the public, and ultimately we're here for the public. The more keywords you put in, the better the chances for their searching being successful. You need to have documentation in order to actually really enhance the experience of people at museums. Objects can speak for themselves, don't get me wrong. I'm all for just looking at artwork and going, oh wow, without actually having any context, but it's the information that goes with it that lets you explore the stories, find hidden things that are fantastic you don't potentially know about. It's really rich resource. Marketing teams really benefit from good documentation. You don't want to be reinventing the wheel each time you want to have a simple story about a image of an object that you post on social media. If you've got that information already captured in your database, it significantly speeds things up. So yeah, they're my 2 points. Make yourself more visible and really stress the benefits to them so they're aware of how it helps them in their day job.
Brilliant, thanks Shona. And Tanya, have you got something you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, just following on really from what Shona said about not assuming that your colleagues know what you do. It's so powerful to sort of share what you're doing with colleagues and in your organisation. See, on a day-to-day basis, you're always busy doing what you do and might not get the opportunity to collaborate with each other. So, an example, at the moment, we're actually reviewing a lot of our collections management policies at Liverpool, and we're doing this with colleagues across the organisation, not just in our department, in collections care, which is a fantastic opportunity to kind of talk to colleagues about what we're doing and why we're doing it, but also to get their sort of feedback and their investment in it as well, because obviously documentation, it's not just, you know, the teams involved in collections management's responsibility, it's everyone's responsibility across the organisation. So it's a good opportunity to kind of to advocate for that and to work with colleagues to do that.
Really interesting point, Tanya, thank you. Did either Rosalind or Philip want to expand on any of that points? Yeah, sure. Philip.
Yeah, I mean, I think echoing everything that has been said, but you know, one of the real fundamental points to get across is how critical all this documentation is. Is it a business critical part of your mission to have good documentation? And I think it depends really, obviously, which colleagues you're talking to, whether you're talking at a higher level, you're advocating for you know, some piece of investment, something that you really want to achieve to advance the mission of your museum and really kind of cement what documentation can do for delivering your vision of the future. So it can be really at quite a high level, very important to be visible at that level, as well as to be really friendly and supportive and communicative right the way down through, you know, everyone who works with you and volunteers and so on. So it's a very much an embracing, all-embracing mission, I think, that, you know, documentation is all about. And it's really ultimately about communication, isn't it? Language, communication at all levels.
Yeah, absolutely. Rosalind.
I would just reiterate everything that has already been said, but also just in terms of access, and I know that's a really important thing, and our kind of users, at the end of the day, without that documentation, we don't really have anything to use. And I think importantly, the information is always changing. And I think especially now, 2021, we know that what has been documented before may not be the views of people now, but without that kind of previous documentation, how would we have anything to kind of hook that on? So I think, as Shona and everyone else has already said, you know, making your colleagues aware of what you're doing is really important, but also kind of how we can engage with our users now more than ever is really important, and kind of documentation is the kind of core of that. At least that's what I think, being collections management.
Yeah, no, I think we all agree. I think that's a really good example of what I was saying in terms of context that's informing. So I think a lot of our colleagues might not understand that documentation is never finished. It is an evolving thing. It's not something that you do and you've finished it. You know, there's no such thing as a finished catalogue record. It's something that I sometimes disappoint people with in our training sessions, but it is an evolving practice. So I think that's a really good point. Great. Any other thoughts on that before I've got a follow-up question on that point? So I thought it was interesting that the question framed it was talking about how we can encourage people to do and see the value of good documentation. So I thought it might be interesting to have a bit of a discussion, which I think we've already started to touch on in terms of what we mean by documentation, why we're doing it. But does anyone have any thoughts or responses on that side of things, going back to, you know, why are we doing this in the first place? What is it for? You know, access, accountability, all those different areas. Anyone got any thoughts on that they'd be happy to share? Yeah, Shona, thanks.
Yeah, I'm completely with you in terms of good documentation being never ending, and I strongly feel good documentation should evolve and actually incorporate the opinions of the public as well into our catalogues. It's really crucial, and also to keep looking at your paperwork, because most museums have got a huge stash of paperwork alongside the catalogue, which will also have additional information, and there's an ongoing project there to keep populating your database. But I mean, good documentation, obviously following spectrum procedures is crucial, and yeah, making sure it is being relevant to people and useful as well, because if it's not useful, what's the point?
Yeah, I think it was maybe Tanya had unmuted and then Philip. Yeah, is that all right? Tanya first and Philip.
So yeah, just similar thoughts really on that. I mean, I'm sure we've all seen the examples where of poor documentation, let me say, and how actually that's really been helpful in terms of trying to pick that and the kind of time spent on that. And also mentioned before, we had talked about the kind of different people involved in documentation in the different departments, or and how they might want to use that information as well. And so it's kind of thinking about how, as Shona said, it's you know, it's how useful it is to them as well as you, and thinking about that and following the kind of guidance, as you said, from Spectrum as well.
Yeah, I mean, I do agree. I think, what was I going to say? I think one of the issues I come across is this question of sort of sharing the responsibility for contributing information more widely. That is not entirely straightforward, because obviously, in a very practical sense, you can have the situation where one person's documentation is overwritten by another. And, you know, these sorts of issues can develop. So quality control, in whatever way that is exercised, is an important issue. The more widely you sort of throw it open, the more those quality control issues, I think, can creep in. And it's certainly true, we've all seen plenty of examples of, as it were, bad documentation where, for whatever reason, you know, there's sometimes an accumulation of problems over a number of years, which really can take, it can be a big hurdle to sorting things out, and they can themselves be a barrier to convincing others that, you know, the documentation is in fact worth having if the quality is poor. So I do think all those things go together, but certainly considering quality of information, just straightforward, making sure that the information is consistent, supporting all those procedures, but also making sure you do have good user guides, think through those questions about language, contemporary, language, what is acceptable and what isn't. Make sure you've got that really nice and clear, so there is a good guide for everybody involved to follow.
We couldn't have a Collections Trust panel discussion without talking about Spectrum, could we? Obviously, we need to get those 9 primary procedures in order for our accreditation returns. So obviously there's that element, but I think we also need to kind of break down the boundary between content creation and kind of the access. Because we kind of very used to working in silos, but actually our end goal is kind of the same. So I think it's probably, and I think all organisations are probably guilty of this, of kind of having your agenda and working to your agenda, but it's, and Tanya's mentioned this, that kind of you need to know what other departments need and want from that documentation. And like Philip said, I think one of the barriers we have is historically, if there's a problem with the documentation, then it seems like it's quite a hurdle to kind of go back and review and kind of fix the problems of the past. But, you know, I don't think there's no one size fits all for anything, and all organizations are different, and we've all inherited different systems and different numbering systems and different, you know, so I kind of think all organizations are kind of starting from the same place, but there is no one size fits all for good documentation. But following the Spectrum procedures is obviously the best place to start. And I have to say that the first time I kind of realized, because I thought to myself, do I follow Spectrum? But actually, having worked in a big institution whose processes were based on Spectrum, I suddenly realized my day-to-day work was Spectrum. I wasn't even thinking about it. And I think people think it's a massive hurdle because there's all these kind of pages and pages of information, but actually if it's adopted by the museum as your day-to-day practice, then it's really easy and you don't even have to think about it.
Yeah, that's a good point. Thanks, Rosalind, for that. I think it's interesting, barriers and gatekeeping is a bit of a theme that's coming up within the organisation, let alone outside the organisation. So I think Tanya's point about, and yours, Rosalind, about what information do our colleagues need, and also what information are they producing that we might want to sort of manage within our system, is really important, because if people can't use something, of course they're not going to think it's important or worth investing in, because it's this thing that sits over here and we're not allowed to access it, let alone edit it. So I think that's an interesting point. And there's actually a comment slash question in the chat, which perhaps is linked to this. So I think it might be worth going to that. So Louise says it's interesting to mention quality control. How can we reassure people that documentation isn't actually terrifying, which is sort of going to some of the points that you guys have been making. I've definitely encountered people being worried about doing it wrong, which is stopping them from feeling able to actually engage with the database, or indeed with the broader documentation, I imagine. But I think people are particularly scared of databases, less scared of writing pen to paper, perhaps. But any thoughts on that? Any responses to that question from anyone? Yeah, Shona, thanks.
So I would be saying any documentation is better than no documentation. I don't think it all has to be done in one go. You know, it's fine to do it in baby steps. If you're more comfortable with using an Excel rather than a database, put it into Excel, because actually most people do import into a database anyway. It's easy to do someone else to do data cleaning in the Excel. You know, you can work with other people on this. I don't think, I think everyone should be supported just to get the documentation into the database in the first place, because then straight away it becomes more accessible.
Yeah, Tanya. Oh, and then Philip.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think it's about it as well, working together and agreeing that standard, so everyone's comfortable with that and knows, you know, what the standard is ahead of time. And it's a kind of about going back to conversations we had before about how people are going to be using the data and what they need to get out of it. And I think that sort of builds people's confidence as well. If, as we said, you know, if they're invested in it, then that helps also.
So I just add to that, I mean, it's really, it is providing a supportive environment, however that might best work out. I don't know if I entirely agree with Shona that anything is better than nothing, you know, because it can be difficult to clean up, you know, really messy data. So, but even the words, I think, data, systems, all these things, they're familiar to some of us, but they are quite scary to some other people. And I think that's fair enough. So I do think providing supportive environments for people, welcoming, really avoiding too much jargon like data cleansing, if that's not in someone's vocabulary, it sounds quite odd. You know, so trying to be inclusive in terms of the language and the way you put something supportive together, depending on the context. So training, you know, training sessions, you know, keep it all as human as possible. You know, I think a good manual, a good, you know, something written down which helps people to feel confident that they're doing it right, and perhaps some other way of looking over people's shoulders, giving them praise where it's due, you know, trying to find the right way to encourage, you know, colleagues, perhaps volunteers and others with whom you're working to really sort of develop that sense of confidence, which would then sort of spur everyone on to do greater things. So I think, you know, I think it is a real issue. Not everybody is comfortable with data or systems, and it's really quite important to try and bridge that.
Yeah, great point about manuals as well, because I think manuals are obviously very important, your set of instructions, but sometimes they are a little bit dry or a little bit intimidating if they're very text heavy, very technical. I think a lot of manuals that I see, I would be quite intimidated if I didn't really necessarily understand all the background, and understanding why I'm doing something is really important for that confidence, and also for understanding that I am doing something correctly, in inverted commas, although it's say there's not necessarily a correct way to do some of these things. And I have definitely experienced that in one of my first jobs. I was told, right, do this, do that, do this. I didn't really understand why. It was to do with temporary numbers, so I didn't know what a temporary number was or what it was for, so I just cracked on doing what I was told. then a year down the line, I finally understand why I'm doing this. And I think, oh, well, I would have done it differently. I would have done that a little bit better. And so it actually does really help to understand why you're doing these things in the context of that. Tanya, did you want to come on in?
Yeah, just something else that I thought of as well that's quite helpful related to sort of training in that supportive environment that Philip talked about is what's also worked in the past is having a rep, someone whose job it maybe is to sort of manage documentation within your sort of museum or department, although it doesn't have to be that person. It could be someone else, maybe a super user who's quite confident in sort of inputting data into a collections management database and sort of making that person the kind of go-to, the I suppose the advocate role for good documentation and good standard, and so that they work with other colleagues in the organisation, and you kind of building up this really good supportive relationship that way. That's something that has worked quite well in other organisations that I've worked in, and where perhaps colleagues haven't been that confident with inputting data or using collections management systems. It's kind of through that trust and building support is really helped them, encourage them to produce good documentation. Yeah.
Shona.
Yeah, just to go back to the some documentation is better than none. I'm going from my point of view of cataloguing here with, I feel like having raw data is better than no data. So it's kind of a starting point. Obviously, I'm fully on board with doing following processes. I love the comment actually about training people. That's just coming in the chat here. It really does help. It's yeah, it can be quite off-putting just to see a big manual. There's also this debate about cataloguing records, whether it's better to have lots of skeletal records or to have few which are perfectly polished. And I think, yeah, sometimes it can be off-putting if you think, oh gosh, this has got to be so perfect before it can go live. But actually, from an accessibility point of view, get your records out there, you know. And as Sarah said, it's a continuous improvement. Everyone is continuously improving it. It never ends.
And that's the way in terms of user-generated content as well. Sometimes, at least if you've got a skeletal record out there, you'll have visitors to your website, visitors to your site that know more about the objects than the people actually working in the organisations quite often. So I feel like getting the information that you have out there is important. I'm just second the comment about training is I agree that rather than handing someone a really large document, which is useful if you have the time to sit down and go through it properly, is yeah, probably quite. And I wouldn't say that I definitely haven't mastered the best way to do this, because obviously everyone is different and learns differently. But I don't know about other people's CMS collections management systems, but I think sometimes they feel like if they do something, it's going to break. Or in our case, I feel like sometimes there's too much choice and there's too much user. Sometimes when there's too much choice, it's intimidating. And sometimes when you feel like you're going to do the wrong thing because you have limited choice, it's difficult. I mean, the only way I became really confident was when I became a kind of power user, and I realized that actually there wasn't that much damage I could do because it's all backed up and it's all fine. So I think just reassuring people that if they make a mistake, there's a way that we can get the information back. That's always one of the first kind of things I say. I kind of tell them, don't worry about it, play around with it. And if you're worried you've done something, just contact us and we'll kind of try and sort it out. But I think it is intimidating, even to people who work in collections management sometimes.
Great. And yes, there is a comment in the chat about encouraging, proper training with a colleague is a way to infuse people rather than giving them a big guidance document. So I think that's a really good point, well made by everyone. I noticed a bit of a theme that's come up related to access, and I don't know how our panel feel, but I think often the documentation is seen as a very separate thing, as Rosalind was saying, this sort of siloed working, and you've got front of house activity versus back of house activity, which, as we know, isn't really the reality, but that's sometimes how it's seen. And I wondered if anyone has any thoughts on the role that policies might play in that, because I find in my experience there's often a disconnect between things like your documentation policy and your access policy, which really should be talking to each other in terms of access to information, all of those sorts of areas, which I think is sometimes, as I say, a bit disconnected, which contributes sometimes to that, that sort of siloed working. Does anyone have any thoughts on that or experiences related to that they'd be happy to share? Yeah, Tanya?
Yeah, so thinking about policies, I mentioned earlier that actually we're going through a review of all of our collections management policies at the moment, and it's been quite interesting in terms of looking, as part of the process, we're looking at our wider museum policies as well. And as Sarah mentioned, you know, where you've got your information policy and your access policy, they should sit together and how separate they are. And so there are some things that we come across where there aren't the joined up thinking perhaps, and those kind of barriers. So and in terms of the way that we're working and we're sort of reviewing our policies are with colleagues across the organisation. Where I mentioned before, it's picking up those things, or kind of coming up with a shared vision, essentially how as an organisation we're going to use and share our information in that way, which I think has been really helpful for where there are instances where maybe certain policies contradict each other, and so overcoming those and coming up more a shared vision. And I suppose, and again, it ties back to your overall organisation's vision and what you want to achieve in your mission statement, and kind of picking that up through that as well.
Great. Philip, yeah.
Yes, just to agree really, but certainly, you know, the whole question really of making the case for documentation is all about who you're talking to and who you're pitching to. So in terms of policies, which might be signed off at trustee level or at a, you know, senior management level, then certainly there is quite a lot of explanation. You've got to use the right words, not necessarily dwell too deeply on the detail, but match what it is that, you know, the sort of documentation strand or the collections management strand, whatever, can make to the success of the mission. And so I think those arguments, making the case at that sort of level, may involve, in a way, a kind of translation, but into clear, well-argued language around efficiency, workflows, that kind of thing, compliance. All of those areas are very key to the concerns of senior management. You know, improvements, what's going to be better? Is there a step change, a really big change needed? That could be a project, or, you know, making the distinction between what is a project versus what is business as usual, you know, but, you know, it may or may not result in linking through to other specific plans, or it might be just a sort of emphasis within a general policy. And certainly the link between this supposed back of house documentation set of procedures, the link between that and the support for wider engagement, you know, the mission of your institution, you know, linking through to anything marketing, you know, CRM, EDI, anything that is relevant to the mission of the organization, making those connections, I think is also, you know, really, really important, and definitely part of the message, you know, to sort of do away with the idea that it is a silo, because it clearly isn't a silo, but explaining that at a kind of policy level is really critical. And if you get that right, then with a bit of luck, other good things will flow from that in terms of, you know, resources and making things happen, which is really what we're trying to do.
Yeah, exactly. And I guess that's going back to that informing and advocacy, it's almost about putting on someone else's hat and going, well, what's their priority? Are they very risk averse? In which case, maybe my argument needs to be about sort of mitigation of risks or whatever sort of hat they might wear. We had a question about organisations or teams that might be resistant to change that I thought might be interesting to discuss now. And I think one thing that I usually try and do if I know that someone is going to be slightly resistant to an idea is not only come up with arguments for, but try and think what are the arguments they're going to come back against and how can I respond to those. So I think that can be quite useful exercise to sort of brainstorm why they might think it's a bad idea or why they might be resistant to that change. But does anyone else have any experience or thoughts for people who are perhaps a little bit more resistant to some of these things, these different ideas or changes in practice? Shona?
Yeah, a tool to do when people are resistant to change is really effective to show them examples of good practice elsewhere, because it's just that reassurance, like, have a look at this site's amazing. There are so many good websites out there. Yeah, again, if you're looking at online catalogs, for examples where everything is connected, you can click on one thing and link to another thing, and then link to another thing and link to another. So I think some examples like that. We have just started looking into adding images to Wikimedia Commons. And there's so many examples of stats out there with other museums have found that to be really useful. The evidence is out there, and it could be a really effective tool for convincing people why change is required.
So show them success, basically. That's a really good idea. Yeah. Anyone else have any thoughts on that sort of resistance to change or any tactics for that? I think Shona's hit the nail on the head. That one. Great. So we had another interesting question. All of these start to sort of converge. So we touched on this a little bit already, I think. But somebody submitted an issue where they work with multiple collections, multiple teams, multiple sites, which might have different priorities, different needs, and ways of working. And sometimes that can be quite hard to advocate or even just coordinate that sort of those efforts when it comes to documentation. So I wondered if any of our team on the panel have any thoughts about that side of things. I know that Philip at the National Trust had lots of different properties to deal with. I can see Rosalind just popped her hand up. So whoever wants to go first, either Rosalind or Philip, respond to that one.
I was just going to say, so I work across, we have 10 museums in Norfolk that we work across, and they all have different kind of, not agendas, because we're a museum service, but they have different priorities depending on where they are and their audiences and things like that. But in terms of documentation and their documentation plans, we managed to kind of prioritize what they should be doing for meeting minimum standards, but also enrichment of their collections. So when they're doing a project for an exhibition, in doing that project they're getting new photography, they're doing an audit, so kind of also documenting that, and then documenting when they've completed something. And we do it in the same way. We use the same plan across sites, but obviously the content of the plan is completely different, but that doesn't really matter. It's kind of, as long as it works for the site and you're recording it somewhere. I mean, in terms of the question that we got, I think Philip probably has more experience of that type of scenario, but in terms of working across different sites, I think it is possible to kind of, you can quantify other people's priorities in a similar way, and also record their successes, because I think a lot of the time with documentation we're always kind of pointing out what's not going right, but actually there's lots of stuff we are achieving and we should be pleased that we're achieving. So I make sure on my documentation plans we do have a completed, I know it's never complete, but something that we've completed in recent years, so that we have something to go back and look at. How much resources did it take, how long did it take, how many people did it take? So when we are planning for the future, we've got a realistic expectation of what can be achieved. But over to Philip, because he'll have more suggestions when it comes to
I don't know. I mean, I think multiple sites, multiple collections, geographical spread, dispersal, people not physically seeing each other from, you know, one end of the year to the next. All of those things are sort of natural barriers perhaps, or difficulties in achieving good quality, good consistency, common practice, all of those things. So they are, on the face of it, they're not sort of very good cousins, but you know, it can be done, I think. What is, I think, wonderful is if you do set out a reasonably clear policy or plan, the way that people will respond and rally round, and fantastic work is done. Just perhaps to give one National Trust example, but it is also true in terms of the work I'm now seeing in, you know, all the different museums in the Southeast. But, you know, to give a National Trust example, we wanted some years ago now to get photography going of the collection, inventory photography. From that sort of call, as it were, to arms, we didn't have any resources to do it. We just wanted people to do it. But some fantastic photographers emerged from among the various people who worked at properties and produced absolutely beautiful photographs. And we did provide a lot of guidance. We were very lucky to have support from expert, volunteer, mainly volunteer help. We didn't really have any money, but you know, the work that, so basically people's talents emerge. If you give them a good task, people's talents emerge, and it's a wonderful thing to see. Obviously, you will have different talents emerging in different places. And I think this is something else to just really sort of manage your own expectations. You won't get the same talents or the same quality everywhere. It will depend on what resources or what people there are. So, you know, there's a sort of measure of sort of celebrating difference as well as uniformity, and wherever those talents exist and people do sort of respond to the challenge that they're given, you know, then I think that's really worth celebrating. So I think it's a great opportunity. It can be obviously in sort of CPD terms, all of these other things, training. We did have some schemes for, you know, sort of younger people. All sorts of things are possible for really bringing people into the fold and working across, you know, a widely dispersed group of sites, different sorts of collections, different sorts of heritage contexts, all of these things, but they can bring out all kinds of good qualities in the people who are there. So I just think if you've got a strong mission, if you can communicate it, that in itself can leap across, you know, sort of geographical distance. It helps to provide a sort of rallying point, and people will respond to it. So, you know, at the end of the day, you know, I feel the sort of message that none of these things is ever finished is a good one. It's not a sort of simple fixed end point. If photographs are done beautifully in one place one day and somewhere else the next day, that's fine. You know, it can all build over time. So again, there's no need to have a very fixed idea as exact order in which everything has to happen. There are lots of different ways you can accommodate and be flexible across different situations, but with a good common outcome.
Yeah, Tanya.
Yeah, I was just going to say on that, the issue is with working with multiple sites, just thinking about, don't underestimate the power of talking and communication. And you're sort of, if you're based at a particular site, you sort of sometimes maybe working in a silo, but you know, and don't have necessarily the opportunities to talk to colleagues at other sites. But if you can position yourself in a, or you know, allow yourself the opportunity to go and speak to all colleagues at sites and understand what they're working on and what they're doing. And as we talked about before, I'm sure that their sort of priorities are in line with yours in terms of your mission statement and the projects that you know, the outcomes that you want to gain. So I think, you know, communication is probably key, and make sure you keep talking to your colleagues and, you know, and finding out what their priorities are as well is helpful.
Great, thanks, Tanya. And we've had in the chat, but also it was going to be my next submitted question as well, on a similar theme around. So we talked about the importance and persuading people to do these things and sort of all of those sorts of stuff, but we haven't necessarily talked specifically about advocating for resource for some of this work. Particularly the question that was submitted in advance was around inventory work, that sort of backlog type stuff, you know, really sort of getting to grips with your basics. So does anyone have any thoughts, whether that's within the organisation or within the sector, in terms of, you know, funders, other sort of bodies, of how we might advocate for those resources, for those sorts of core documentation projects? Does anyone have any thoughts on that? It's not an easy question. Shona, go for it.
I think it is a case of tying it into broader projects. So I think collections reviews are fantastic. They often incorporate an exhibition at the end of the project. They often incorporate consultation with the public. There's some fantastic projects out there, disposal projects, you know, where the public could come in and say, you know, and we've asked, you know, should we be disposing of this item? And that's happened in lots of different places. Collection reviews obviously help you recognise condition of your collections. They help you spot star objects that you didn't know anything about. They often, when you're doing it, you're making storage improvements at the same time. And I think when you can show you're ticking so many boxes from projects like that across all the different sort of departments of a museum, that can be really powerful for saying, give us money.
Yeah, anyone else have any thoughts on that one? Tanya?
Yeah, so I completely agree with what Shona said, and particularly in terms of sort of every time you sort of want to access an object, whether that's for an exhibition or because you're going to do something with it, research it or move it, I think there's always an opportunity there potentially for funding, and we talked about tying it into other projects as well, and thinking about how other sort of colleagues might want to use that collections information as well, whether that's colleagues in your PR team, potentially if you've got one, or communications team, you know, in terms of information on social media, all that kind of thing. I think there's opportunities there that you can tap into, and particularly if you're quite savvy and clever. I think, yeah, it's sometimes thinking outside of the box in that sense of where traditionally you might go for funding, but thinking a bit broader in terms of your overall sort of aims as well.
Philip?
Yeah, just to add to that really, and I think, you know, something that certainly goes with the getting the backlog or getting the core documentation sorted out is this question of assessing the significance of what you've got through collection reviews or through you know, interactions with broader communities of people. And really, how many boxes can you tick? If you can identify significant objects and really explore significance and sort of really explain how important it is to communicate significance, and this is what documentation is all about, then, you know, you are onto a bit of a winner really in terms of potentially getting more resources in. So the more you make that explicit, you can literally draw up a sort of a grid and show how many boxes you can tick. If you can say, you know, you're talking about spotting those star objects, yep, they're fantastic to know what those star objects are. They're great for your Christmas cards. They're great for knowing what you've got to get out quick in an emergency. They're great for this, and this. And, you know, the more columns, the more boxes you can tick through assessing significance and doing so on the back of an efficient, well-organized inventory, then, you know, this really gives you a whole lot of ammunition and fuel for the future. So I really do think those are powerful arguments for, you know, looking for increasing your resources and probably looking across multiple strands, trying to get more people interested and on board with what you're doing, and seeing if you can get help in whatever kind that you can to, you know, advance what you're doing. So I do think that is something that is very important. It adds into the sort of mix, the mix of that core information, which lies at the heart of a good inventory. But it's jolly useful for loads of people.
Mm-hmm. Great. And I think from a sector support point of view, certainly at Collections Trust, one thing that we're aware of is that there's lots of people like you guys in the room who are very aware of documentation, very aware of its importance, very aware of the things that we do and that we support. But one of the things we want to work on over the next few months, and obviously longer, is that raising of awareness with sector leaders, whether they're directors, trustees, policymakers, funders. So I think there is a role for sector support as well in some of that advocacy, as well as you guys on the ground within your organisations. Shona, it looked like you had something to add. Do you want to come in?
Yeah, just to say, tourism and income are always areas of interest. You think really how your documentation can contribute to those. So just a really simple example, we've got a Sandra Rhodes exhibition, and my documentation officer has just put together a themed package of pink items to support that, which is we're using on social media. Really, really simple, cheap, and it helps drive people to our sites and increase awareness of our collections, and simultaneously obviously encourages people to explore our online catalogue. So it doesn't all have to be really expensive, but they're really quick wins, and I would really encourage using social media to actually highlight what's going on with the documentation work.
Great, thanks, Shona. So I've just noticed the time, we're on sort of 4 minutes remaining. So I just wonder whether it's on that question or whether it's something that people want to revisit or something new that they want to raise. I thought it might be nice for our panel maybe to give us some final thoughts, each of you, in whatever order you want to go in. Does anyone have any final thoughts they'd be happy to kick us off with for the last few minutes, and then we'll go round? I don't want to pick on anyone.
I guess, well, from my point of view, I guess we're all stakeholders in the museum, whether we're documentation, collections management, learning teams, marketing teams. So I guess we need the whole organisation to buy into the same kind of message. And I think whether we like it or not, there is a culture of change within museums, and we and especially within the last 15, 20 years, in terms of that horrible word digitization, which means different things to different people. But the world has changed since museums first started. So I think this is just another we do have to think about documentation and what that means and how we work going forwards. And it might be that our workforce changes and the kind of skills that we have diversify, but it's just a sea of change is basically all I would end with, and it's an ever-changing kind of environment that we're working in, and we kind of need to be responsive to it.
Yeah, great, thanks, Rosalind. Anyone else have any final thoughts they'd like to leave us with? Tanya? All of you?
Shall I go? Just to say, really, you talked a lot about collaborative working, really, and sort of thinking about the future of documentation in terms of what Rosalind was saying about thinking differently and what we want from documentation and how we do it. And I suppose my thoughts are in terms of thinking more about the kind of stakeholders and more of a wider collaborative working, in the sense of we talked about gatekeepers and those traditional kind of roles, people who might manage that documentation, but sort of thinking more broadly now and making it sort of everyone's responsibility and everyone's activity to get involved in documentation.
Yes, I think it's not new to say this, but it really is about your widest possible audience, and where once upon a time it was all back office. It certainly isn't that now. When you're writing, when you're thinking about what to say about an object, think of your audience. It really is key to sort of write well, just write well, make sure what you produce communicates well, and really it's a a fantastic field for the future. It's nothing like the past. You know, the future for documentation is something so totally different that I think, you know, we're only just beginning really along that whole process of transformation.
Thanks. And Shona, last but not least.
Yeah, just want to add for the importance of documentation, health and safety. We all have the delights of working with museum objects that have mercury, formalin, formaldehyde, naphthalene, you know, asbestos, arsenic, the lot. You know, we look after these things. If you haven't got your documentation clearly identifying those hazards, it's really quite precarious. So it's something it's a useful reminder to you know, to colleagues and also funders. You know, they're crucial that we have these processes in place to make sure that we're not, you know, getting having difficulty. Also, just with documentation, it's just so crucial to have people involved in documentation. Technology is changing all the time. The society is changing around the time. Obviously, this talks about colonization. We need to keep evolving. So I think, yes, clearly biased, but yeah, documentation is extremely important.
Great, thanks, Shona. And thank you, everyone. We're finishing bang on time. It's literally just hit 12 o'clock. So nicely done, everyone. Thank you. Thank you so much to our panel. Really, really appreciate your contributions. Really interesting. And I'm aware we probably haven't, you know, fixed things or given you an exact answer to some of your issues. It's really just some things to think about, things to bear in mind in your own organisations or in your sort of more sector-wide advocacy if you're working on that as well. And thank you as well to everyone who submit questions in advance and also everyone who's contributed in the chat as well. Really interesting thoughts as well as questions. So really appreciate it. And thank you very much for joining us.